Welcome to Celtic Medicine Stories, a podcast where we explore stories from the old Celtic lands, with the understanding that they carry medicine for us. I'm your host, Kat Horton, and I offer these stories in the spirit of the oral storytelling tradition of the British Isles. That is, they are free and they're open to everyone, always. Although these stories often have come from another time and have evolved through time with the oral storytelling tradition, they are here still for a reason. If you're curious about going deeper with this story, with the images, symbols, characters, landscapes, sounds, whatever it is that's speaking to you from this particular story, then there are some free resources below which will help guide you in that process. This story is again from the Scottish borders where I grew up. It continues the theme of the last two episodes, these extreme moments of total enlightenment after the accidental consumption of some magical liquid, just like Taliesin in Wales and Finn McCoull in Ireland. Michael Scot was a historical person in the early 13th century who became known as the Borders Wizard. He was a highly educated man who studied in some of the finest schools of the time in Europe and translated Arabic texts. He likely held much esoteric knowledge. Another legend tells that he created the Eildon Hills in the Borders by cutting a larger hill in 3 pieces with his staff. The Eildons, you might remember from episode 1, are where Thomas the Rhymer was whisked away by the Queen of Elphame. We may never know the reality of Michael Scot's knowledge and the magical ability he had, but this is one story that became attached to his name over the years and survived into our time as part of the lore of the Scottish borders. So as you listen to this story, as with all these Celtic medicine stories, let yourself float. You don't need to pay attention in the way maybe you were asked to do in school. You don't need to try and follow the plot line or the dialogue or anything in particular. In fact, the medicine lies in what you find yourself attending to. So when you let yourself go into that receptive, floaty state and you find your mind wanting to savor an image or a sound or a word, and you find yourself more engaged with that than whatever it is that I'm saying, then notice that. You don't need to analyze it or try and figure it out in that moment, but just notice it, that called your attention, because that's where the medicine lies. Wherever this story interacts with your story is what you're looking for. And I believe this is part of why these stories have been around for so long, is because they each interact with us in some special way. And so as you listen, just let yourself absorb it and notice which parts stick out to you. It was one of those dreek autumn days in the Scottish borders. The mist was hanging low and it wasn't quite clear if it was mist or rain, but you were definitely getting wet when you were outside. Grey kind of day. This was the day that Michael Scot chose to walk to Edinburgh to seek his fortune. It's a couple of days' walk, so he got himself ready, got his big thick woolen cloak on and his big strong oat staff. A couple of friends were going to come with him because they too thought that their fortune might lay in the big city of Edinburgh. So off they set, Michael wearing his thick woolen cloak to keep that wet damp from his bones, and they strode along the hills. As they set off there, pretty chatty, telling stories and riddles and jokes to each other. And as the day wore on, of course, they tired, legs getting spent, but it was good. But it felt good to walk over the hills, crashing through the brown bracken, seeing the last of the heather for the year. And towards the latter part of the afternoon, the sun was getting really low. They started to descend down a hillside into a wee glen. Really pretty little place, covered in moss and ferns, trees huddled closer together. There was a burn that flowed through it. Bubbling water heading its way down towards the coast. And it was one of those places, one of those places where you just sort of stop and you have to take it in because it feels different from where you were before. Something different, something a little otherworldly, maybe. Feels like all three of them stopped and just took it in. Then they saw on one of the trees there were hanging some prayers that had been tied up in bits of cloth over the little burn. And as they glanced around, they saw a really big oak tree on the other side of the burn. And as they were just trying to get a feel for the place and trying to grasp what was maybe a little different in this glen, out from behind that big, huge oak tree came the biggest white serpent any of them had ever seen. The thing was many feet long, and it seemed to have a girth of like a small tree, and it was coming right at them. Michael noticed right away that his two friends started stepping back pretty quick. It was coming towards him, belly on the ground, but its head up and its tail up. So as it came, he didn't have any time to think about it, but he took his staff and with one whoosh, whoosh, 2 strokes, he cut this serpent into 3 pieces. It was laying on the ground. "Ooh, that was lucky," said one of his friends. Michael didn't think it had anything to do with luck at all. But he said, Aye, that's the biggest serpent I've ever seen." And they all hurried out of that glen pretty quickly. They just left it laying there, and they headed north where they were trying to get to. Now, as it started to get proper dark, they were looking for somewhere that they maybe could spend the night. There wasn't a lot around, so they were picked up their pace, walking a little more quickly. And then just over on the next hill, they saw a little glow. And as they got closer, yep, it's definitely a wee house. And it was a little stone cottage with a slate roof. There was a warm glow coming out the windows, and they thought, well, maybe we can get something to eat and we can get a good bed for the night. So they knocked on the door. And the door creaked open. There was this old lady behind the door, and she said, "Oh, come on in. You look like you could need a bite to eat and a place to sit, and come sit by my fire. I've got a stew going, and just come on in." So they did. He hung his cloak up and leant his staff up against the wall, and they took off their muddy boots, and they settled into some of the wooden chairs in this little kitchen that this lady had. And they noticed that the fire was going strong, and she had this big cast iron stove that took up the whole fireplace, where she had pots of things, and the kettle was going, and there was a pile of wood next to it so she could keep it stoked, and this big old wooden table that seemed to have all sorts of stories of meals carved into it. That's where they sat. She fed them a stew. Michael couldn't quite tell what it was. Rabbit, maybe? Rabbit and turnips? Not sure. But it filled the hole, It kept them. It filled their bellies after that long day of walking. And it was warm. And they told the old lady the stories of the day and what had happened, and especially about this white serpent. And as Michael told her the story of the serpent, he could see the old woman's eyes getting wider and wider, and she seemed to be prickling with energy. She could hardly hold it in until he'd finished telling the story, and then she said, "You didn't just leave it there, did you?" "Well, yeah. What else were we going to do with it?" "Oh, no. You can't just leave it there. You see, this has happened before. I've heard stories of this old serpent. People have cut it in pieces before, and it comes back." "What do you mean it comes back?" "It comes back. It regenerates itself somehow. That burn is full of healing waters. Everybody knows that. People go there, pray for healing. Didn't you see? Well, that snake just gets in, I think. I think it just gets into the burn, and it gets all healed up, and then it seems to become even bigger. And it'll come after you. I've seen it before. It'll come after you. You have to go back and get the middle section, bring it back to make sure that it can't regenerate itself." "What? What do you mean go back and get the middle section?" "Yes, absolutely. There's nothing else to do. You have to go back and get it." Oh, no, Michael had his belly full, and he was all warm, and he was sitting there, and it was dark and cold and rainy. "Okay, well, if that's what you think I should do, then that's what I'll do." Well, his two friends announced they were going to bed, and so he got his boots on, and he got his cloak on, and he got his staff, and he headed back out into the dark. Now, he retraced his steps all the way back over those 2 hills and back down into that wee glen. It was very dark now, and he had to poke around to try and find the parts of the snake. Luckily, the moon was out, so the white of its skin was starting to glow in the moonlight, so he could see 2 pieces of it. But he realized the old woman was right, because that part with the head was gone. It had crawled off somewhere. So he managed to find the middle piece, and he wrapped it up in some cloth, and he threw it in his back sack, and he headed back to the house. The old lady was still up. She was waiting for him. She said, "Have you got it? Have you got it? Did you get it?" He thumped it down on the table, unraveled it. "Yes, that's it, great." Oh, now he sat down exhausted. And she said, "Okay, I'm gonna get it in the oven." Okay. Michael didn't have any energy to argue with her at this point. Okay. He just sat in the chair and started to drift off. Now she got this piece of snake all dressed up in an iron pan, and she got it slotted in her oven, clicked in, and she stoked up the fire underneath it, and she said to him, "Now don't touch it. Okay. Don't touch it, don't taste it, just stay here and make sure nothing happens to it. I'm going to go and sleep." And Michael nodded, and he dozed off in front of the fire, and she went off to the bedroom at the back, and off she went to sleep. Now at some point in the night, Michael woke up. He was in a wooden chair, wasn't very comfortable, and he could smell this amazing smell coming from the oven. He listened. He could hear the old lady snoring. It smells really good, so he just got a wee cloth, and he opened up the door in the oven and just had a peek in, just to have a look. The smell was amazing, and he could hear it sizzling. And so he just reached his finger in. He wasn't going to touch it, just reached his finger into the pan just to touch the juice. And as his finger touched the juice, oh, it's hot! He put his finger in his mouth. And in that moment, he felt like he knew everything in the world. Suddenly, all the answers he knew simultaneously, all in one moment, without even being able to know that he knew the answers. Suddenly, everything, this whole world of knowledge was inside of him. He took his finger out of his mouth. Whoa. What just happened? And before he could even answer the question, he heard the back door of the bedroom opening, and she came in and she looked at him. Ah! She shook her head in dismay. "You tasted it, didn't you? I can tell you tasted it." He just looked at her. So she said, "Well, Michael, so now you know. Now you know the wisdom that this serpent carries. And it's in you. I see that. I see it in your eyes. Sit down, Michael. Will you do me at least the honour of answering some of my questions? I've been waiting for years to get a hold of this salmon. Years! And I've got a lot of questions. And would you, at the very least, just sit with me and answer my questions?" He said, "Of course." So they sat down in front of the fire in 2 chairs, and for the whole rest of the night, she just poured out all these questions about life and death and the world and healing and magic and divination and everything she could think of. And to his utter surprise, he was able to answer all of them. Now, by the time dawn came, she was pretty satisfied. She was like, okay, I can work with all that. I can work with that. "Well, Michael, what are you going to do?" And he said, "Well, I'm going to keep going to Edinburgh." And she said to him, now that you've tasted this serpent, the fairies will do your bidding." "Really?" "Aye. That's what everyone's always said about that serpent. That once you've tasted it, the fairies will do your bidding." Well, he didn't know about all that, but he knew he needed to move on, and so he got his friends together, put his cloak on, got his staff, and said goodbye to the old woman, thanked her for her hospitality, and out they went. Now, it was starting to get much colder than it had been the day before, and as they had a good another whole day to walk before they got to Edinburgh, and sometime around after lunchtime, they realised it was starting to snow. And it was starting to come down a little bit too heavy. It was getting very wet and cloggy on the boots because the earth was still wet. And so Michael said, "Why don't we do this?" And he held his staff between his legs and he said, "Come on, jump on." His 2 friends got on behind him, and all he had to do was think thoughts of flight, and up they went. The staff lifted them up above the snowy hills, and they glided north towards Edinburgh. Now we decided we'd better land it before they got into town so as not to draw too much attention to themselves. So they landed it just south of Edinburgh, and they walked the last couple of miles into town. And as they were walking up Clark Street, an old man stopped them. And he said, "Hello, my friends. I'm curious that you have snow on your caps and on your shoulders, and it's not snowing here. How did that happen?" Yeah, it was just snowing a moment ago. Didn't you notice? It was just snowing. The old man looked at them wearily and said, "Okay," and kind of backed away and turned around a corner and disappeared pretty quickly. And at that point, Michael turned around and he noticed his two friends had disappeared pretty quickly too. And he thought this was probably for the best. And he went off to find himself somewhere to stay. Now it turns out Michael realised that the fairies indeed would do his bidding for him, but they'd only do it at night for some reason. That didn't seem to matter. He seemed to gather a whole group of fairies that just loved to build stuff. They wanted to build bridges and houses and churches and roads and all sorts of things out of stone and wood, and they were just relentless. They wanted to just build all night long. So Michael started selling his services as in construction and building things in the town of Edinburgh. And his services became so popular that he was invited all over to other parts of Scotland to build bridges and wells and buildings and roads and all these things. And people would be amazed how quickly these things got built. And it seemed like they went away from the site in the evening, and then when they came back in the morning, it was almost done. He had such a high demand for his services that he became very famous and quite rich. And it was such high demand, he was worried that the fairies were going to get tired, but they seemed to have a relentless appetite for creation. They just kept making more and more things. And so it was that Michael Scot found his fortune in Edinburgh. Thank you for listening to this episode of Celtic Medicine Stories. If you want to go deeper, check out my Working with Archetypes free email course. There's a link somewhere in these notes. You'll find it. And feel free to visit on my website, kathoughton.com, KATHOUGHTON.com. I'd love to hear from you. Go well.